Welcome to Wealthy Living Conversations. I'm Lisa, your host and founder of Wealthy Living. It's here that I connect with a variety of people to have inspiring and insightful conversations to help you live a meaningful, connected and well life, both personally and professionally. So our choices impact our work, health and relationships. And today I'm chatting with Jenny Cole to talk about the choices people make when it comes to helping others and discuss why helping is not always helpful and how to avoid the advice trap. And also about the relationships dynamics that are played out in these circumstances. So I think you're going to really be able to resonate with much of what we're talking about today. So let me introduce Jenny. Jenny's an executive coach, facilitator, educator, and mother to Albert the Spaniel, running two businesses, Positively Beaming and Beaming Consulting. Jenny believes that the world is always ready for a little more joy, and her focus is ensuring you find it and build it into your life. Despite being a committed, excellent educator of 20 years and a recognised national expert in the field of special education, she has crashed and burned, walking out on a career she loved, an exhausted wreck. Her nervous breakdown / spiritual awakening led her to study why and how people thrive and the simple things we can do each day to make it so. So welcome, Jenny.
Thank you, Lisa. It's so lovely to be here.
Oh, it's so good to finally chat and see you again after we didn't see each other since before COVID hit in the lovely Fiji.
Fabulous, wasn't it?
Yeah, so good. Oh my God. So sometimes we think the best thing we can do for a person is to offer help and advice, but this can have implications on both the helper and the person being helped. And I'm looking forward to really getting into the juice of this. So despite Jenny's work having a focus on leadership, there is a relating dynamic that's played out in all relationships, work and personal. And today we're going to talk more generally, giving you the opportunity to relate to the content in any circumstance. It's also important for you to know that Jenny and I are both coaches and facilitators, and we're not psychologists or counsellors. So what we are bringing to this conversation is our own formal and informal learnings and lived experience with ourselves and our clients in human behaviour. If you disagree with any of the content we share today, that's okay, and we welcome any feedback or contribution to the conversation. You can use the contact page or either of our websites, or reach out on social media or leave a comment to further contribute to today's topic. So Jenny, I'd love to begin by maybe just talking about some definitions. So can you define for me, what does helping mean?
Oh gosh, that's an excellent question. I think helping is probably more of an urge. It's that sense that we get that somebody requires our assistance. Somebody is struggling to do something, and therefore if we have the skills or the knowledge or the wherewithal, we will offer that assistance and therefore help make it easier, smooth the waters for them.
Great. And what about helpful?
So helping is giving of the assistance, but being helpful is if that assistance is actually useful to the other person. And that's, I think, the key here is that sometimes helping is not necessarily helpful. It's not necessarily what the receiver needs or wants or is looking for.
Yeah, brilliant. Great distinction there. And that gives a lot of clarity, which can lead into the conversation. And what about, can you tell me, what do you think contributes to advice? So I just want to sort of discuss some of these things before we get into further conversation about it. So what contributes to advice giving?
So I guess advice is when you've got knowledge that you want to be helpful with. And so somebody's got a problem, a concern, a challenge, and you've got some advice, some knowledge or skills that you think could be useful, and it's often things that you've done yourself or that you know about. So it's something that it's the old, oh, I've done that, or that's happened to me, let me tell you. So that's giving advice in order to be helpful. So what contributes to that is a feeling that you have something to contribute because you've got an experience, or you've read a book or seen something on the internet. So advice is a way of trying to be helpful, I guess.
Yep, fantastic. And lastly, what is the advice trap?
Now we all have the advice trap. I actually call it the advice monster. It comes from the work of Michael Bungay Stanier, and he says it's that little voice that's right here all the time that we all have when someone's sharing with us their challenge or their problem, or just even having a whinge about something that's happening in their life. The advice monster is that little thing right here that's saying, I've got something to say, I've got something to tell you, I've got some great advice, I can be helpful here. And the advice trap is when we let that advice monster out, perhaps a little too early. And that we rush to help, we rush to give advice, we rush to let the advice monster out. That's the advice trap.
Brilliant. So thank you. I think it's really good to just clarify some of those terms before we head into more the juice of the conversation. Now, I think the good place to maybe start with is looking at relationship dynamics and what contributes to people owning certain roles. So sometimes these roles, some people term them as maybe the victim, the persecutor, or the rescuer. And sometimes that's referred to the dreaded drama triangle.
Yes.
So can you talk us through these relationship dynamics or this dreaded drama triangle, and maybe share in your view what makes up the victim, the persecutor, and the rescuer?
Yeah, absolutely. So the drama triangle comes from a pretty outdated model in psychology called transactional analysis, which is really quite useful. But essentially, transactional analysis, TA, says that in any conversation, the idea is that both people stay adult. But dysfunctional relationships, and this could be work or home or any sort, often descend into the drama triangle. And the drama triangle has three possible people in it: a victim, a rescuer, or a persecutor. And in any particular conversation, we can go in and out of each of these roles. So they're not static. We're not a rescuer always or a persecutor always. And we recognise these people. So the victim is that person who feels like they've got no choice, that life is hard, everybody's picking on them, that there are no options, it's all a bit hopeless, and that they don't have a lot of control. The rescuer always sounds a bit sexier than the others. It always sounds a bit more interesting, but it is equally as dysfunctional, because without a rescuer, you can't have a victim or a persecutor. But with a rescuer, this is the person whose advice monster comes out a lot. Let me help. Let me step in. Let me save you. Let me make that easier for you. The persecutor, on the other hand, is the person, it's a bit of a bully. They're the people with their finger out. And it could just be a teacher or a parent kind of going, well, let me tell you, I know best. They're often all-knowing, or they're often quite controlling. They've got the answers. They know what people need, and let me just show you how to do that. And at work, that could even just look like a micromanager. I don't trust you to do your job. Let me show you how. So they're the three dynamics, and in any situation we can come in and out of. If you think about relationships with your spouse or your family, there's times when we're the victim, times when we're the rescuer, and times when we're the persecutor.
Yeah, brilliant. They were really great ways of explaining each of them. So in summary, would you say maybe the victim is the person who's been harmed or has a perceived hurt? The persecutor is doing the hurting. Yeah. And the rescuer intervenes to support the victim, is say the peacemaker who completes the loop.
tries to avoid the hurt, tries to make sure that, pacifies,
Okay.
And it's just important to know that there are benefits in each of those. So we get something out of being each of those styles.
Yeah.
So a rescuer feels helpful. A victim, often feels like then they can give away control because then they can't take any blame. If you're a victim, you can't be blamed because it had nothing to do with you.
Benefits of being a victim.
Yeah, and there are benefits to being a persecutor. You get to be in control and you get to blame others. So we all get something out of each of those.
Yeah. So if we take the rescuer, because we were concentrating on the helper positions, which is, I suppose, the rescuer, and with the common reasons that people step into that helper or rescuer role. So what are some of the common reasons people step into that role?
I guess one of the ones that I'm most familiar with is just gender-based roles. Women are socialised to be helpful and to be good girls and to not, and to be useful. And but also we just, our hormones make us tend and befriend. Estrogen is that one that says, let's make sure everybody is okay. So often we become those rescuers because it's been very valued by our families or our schooling or whatever. So it can, for women, it can be a very valuable role. And so once we get some feedback that says we've been a great little helper, then we continue to do that. The other thing that kind of exacerbates it is, well, yes, because we get feedback that it's been useful. So we give some advice, we give some help, and someone goes, oh yeah, that was great. And so then we kind of just get in the pattern of repeating that rather than realising that there are other things that we can do.
Yeah, so that caring and compassionate nature and that feeling of value and worth that we get, being the rescuer, and everybody, obviously, most people like to feel valued. So it's, why wouldn't you continue doing it if it brings you value? But it's that sort of, I suppose, that people pleasing, isn't it, that's really bringing you the value. Yes.
And then the people pleasing, and then what often results after that is things like being a, perfectionist. And so not only do we give advice, we give really good advice, well thought out, well logical, beautifully presented advice. And so then things start to run together. And as you said, we get our worth, our value, or feedback from important others about how important it has been to rescue others.
And what about?
It's important to say that I think I may have said earlier, you can't have the other two styles without being a rescuer. So there is no victim or there is no persecutor unless there's a rescuer.
Yeah. So what about, is the possibility of the rescuer also becoming a rescuer to have their own needs met? So that need for control.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Although that does tend to swing more into, once you're doing the rescuing for control, it tends to be more of a persecutor. So persecutor sounds horrible, but if you think parent or teacher, so the parent who's telling you what to do because it will be useful and helpful to you, that's not rescuing, that's persecuting. So they can be similar and you can slide in and out of them quite easily.
And how often have you seen that, like witnessed a situation where a rescuer will come into a situation, or let's call it the rescuer or the helper, and, try to be of worth and be compassionate and be comparing and give advice, but their assessment of the situation is actually incorrect because they don't have the full information with what led to the situation?
That is an excellent question, and that is indeed the advice trap. And can I tell you a little bit of a story? Because this is probably my aha moment.
Sure.
So many years ago, I was a visiting teacher. So I used to visit schools that had children with disabilities enrolled, and I would go and give advice. So I would literally fly in with my big box of stuff that I knew was really important and really great. And I would walk into the teacher's room who would go, oh my goodness me, I've had the worst day with this kid. And I'd go, here's what you need, and here's what you need, and here's what you need, and do this and do this and do this and do that and do something else. And then I'd put the lid on my box and I'd fly home. And I'd go back a couple of weeks later and nothing had been touched. And I'd be, oh, stupid teacher. And then I've moved out of rescuer and into persecutor. They're obviously an idiot. If they'd just done what I'd said, it would have all been okay. And what I realised, sadly in retrospect, was if I had taken 5 minutes to sit and listen and ask questions like, what's going on for you here? And how could I be of best help to you? I would have avoided that whole scenario. And in fact, that's the trick to taming your advice monster, is to ask really good questions. To listen first, to empathise, and then to say, how could I support you? Or what do you need from me? So that you're answering the right question. Sometimes we're coming in with fabulous advice, but we're not answering the right question.
Yeah, it's such a good point. And, it's so great that you recognise that in hindsight, and obviously, now maybe see that as a mistake of your own, or taking self-responsibility and ownership, which then you can apply to other situations going forward. And I think this is the thing, that key piece of when something hasn't worked the way that you want it to work, or you receive the feelings of frustration and anger and all the emotion that comes. The emotions are just the data giving you information to what's going on, or what you can reflect on, or how you can do it differently, or what was your missing piece. And it's so true that your emotions were all valid, feeling frustrated and annoyed. You put all this work, and that if they just did that, then they could have got the outcome that you could so easily foresee. But you probably, like you just said, in hindsight, could have inquired more with a bit more curiosity to maybe get a few missing pieces of what their needs were, and how they then could possibly implement your process in a way that was going to be helpful for their circumstance and their environment.
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head there. It's about speed. The advice monster comes out when we think it is just faster if we tell other people what to do. And it's just not, because we're not in the same context, we haven't tried the same things, we don't have the same styles. And so unless you know someone really well and you're very intimately connected with the scenario, giving advice is often not faster. Because if I give you advice and it doesn't suit you, all you do is blame me, and then we're back into that drama triangle again. Well, what would you know? You think you're so clever. Whereas if I inquire into what you need and you give me a bit more context and a bit more understanding, then together we can come up with some options and some choices that suit you, rather than the advice that suits me.
Yeah. And I think another thing that comes up when we do, as an assumption by often a person who's trying to help, is that just because somebody's in a situation that's difficult, or just because they're unhappy or frustrated or angry, that we feel that we need to help them move out of those emotions that we're judging as being good or bad. And it may not be. They may need to go through that in order to progress to the next place. And a rescue will often manage someone else's emotions rather than letting people experience their emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. None of us are very comfortable with those horrible emotions, and rescuers in particular don't like people to have to sit in that discomfort. But that's where the learning happens. That's when you actually work out what's going on.
Yeah.
Why am I feeling like this? Why am I in this kind of point? And having someone to support you through it, an adult who supports you through it, rather than a rescuer or being the victim or having a persecutor, so much more useful.
Yeah, and I think it often comes up when there's a lot of your own emotions caught up in that relationship. So when there's emotions caught up and there's either you have a deep care for the person or you have a very strong attachment to the outcome of the situation, you can't bear to not come in and intervene because you feel that you can change it all, and that you can make everybody, the person you care for, struggle less, or you can, achieve an outcome that you want to achieve so easily if you just come and do this, this, and this, and this. And so I think that that's where the struggle often happens for rescuers, is that they can see so clearly a different outcome for either the person's emotions or the situation, and holding back and having that ability to just sit back when you can so easily see it is so difficult.
And indeed, that's exactly the strategies for getting out of any of those modes, is because they're ego-driven. As you said, you've got an attachment either to the person or an attachment to the outcome, and all of that's about you. That's not necessarily about them. And the way that you can get out of any of those is to, one, be aware that you're in it, be aware that you're rushing to give advice or you're judging. And then, as you said, shift your posture. If you've got your shoulders up and you're leaning forward, then just kind of disengage and think, you know what, my best job here is not to lean forward and give advice, but just to let it out and take a deep breath. And or if you're feeling like a victim, the same sort of thing, and just kind of a deep breath that allows you to re-engage the logical part of your brain, and just think, okay, so what's the next step here, rather than everyone's just everyone's taking over, or she just wants to tell me what to do. Just being aware that that's where you're going, and disengaging your body from that, because our bodies lead our brains, and we'll often feel those emotions in our bodies first, well before we'll have a name for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely want to talk more about that, about some of the ideas and tips to give people so that they don't fall into the trap of some of these roles, or fall into the trap of advice trap. So before we do that and go into that further, but I love those tips. What are some of the implications or symptoms that you see for a helper or a rescuer? I mean, you discussed, like I shared in the bio, that you were in a position that you really burnt out in the profession that you were in, and I'm just wondering, like, what do you see as maybe some of those signs and symptoms for as a helper or a rescuer?
Yeah, because if you're rescuing others and helping them do their job, who's doing your job, essentially? Yeah. And so rescuers often have very wobbly boundaries. They'll be saying yes to things that aren't theirs to say yes to, or they've started to help people and it's hard to stop. And so it's really easy as a rescuer in particular to be exhausted and overwhelmed. So what you'll notice is exhaustion and overwhelm, but for me, it always bubbles up as resentment. I get really resentful that I'm working harder than everybody else. And so for each individual, it might be different, but it'll be tied to overwhelm. I just can't do anymore. I can't care anymore. And so it will look different for others, but my key is when I'm getting sarcastic, that's my indicator that I'm resentful and that I'm perhaps helping more people than I need to. Yeah, absolutely. And they're really good points. So, that whole, expense of your own time, energy, exhausted, but, possible burnout, etc. And I think that bringing up that idea of resentment, that's a really good one, because that changes once you get to that point of resentment, that changes a whole relationship dynamic. If there's anything that will kill a relationship, it's resentment. Yeah.
And if you get to that point of resentment, it's it's a hard road.
And again, these modes are really interconnected. So I start as a rescuer, but when I end up as a persecutor, I know that I've rescued too much. So a persecutor will say, you're not working as hard as me. You think you whatever. And all of a sudden I'm in a completely dysfunctional mode, just the wrong one. I'm not adult. Going, no, adults have boundaries. Adults say, I've got my own work to do first and then I'll help you, or how do you need help? They're all adult modes and less dysfunctional.
Because there is this really fine line between helping people, and I think that it's really important to point out that helping people is beautiful, like we discussed in the beginning, in those definitions. So it's beautiful, and we're not for any minute indicating that helping people is a bad thing. I think helping people is a beautiful, generous, kind, caring thing to do. But when you begin to be weighted down by others, there's the tipping point. And I suppose it's being able to work out, and it's really difficult. There's often a very fine line between helping and being weighted down.
And there's two things there. One is around boundaries, and I guess it's one of those memes that I shared that I love, which is boundaries is the space in which I can love me and love you simultaneously. So I can help you and love you and care for you, but I can't do it at the expense of my own well-being. So absolutely caring and helpful and all of those is and gracious and compassionate, all fabulous things, but not at the expense of yourself. And also the other person needs to want to be helped, and you want to be able to help them in the way that is most helpful to them.
And it is, it does get tricky, because everybody's idea of I love that definition that you just gave about, caring for yourself and somebody else simultaneously. But what that actually means to different people is different. And so some people have much, and I think this is the key, expectations than other people, and expectations is what often gets people into trouble. And but it is, sometimes I feel in this modern world and all this talk about helping yourself and self-love and boundaries and all of that sort of stuff is fabulous and necessary. But sometimes I think it also gets used by victims as I don't know if it's by the victims, but it's basically gets used as an excuse to not actually give your energy and time to somebody else. And I think that is destructive to human connection as well. So it's this fine line between keeping your own boundaries and using boundaries as an excuse.
Yeah. It's a real dance. And it's complex. It's not as easy as I've described it. This is just a model to explain sort of dynamics. But building on from what you've just said, two things. There's the personal, one-on-one in a relationship, when it's clear that somebody is asking for help, or when you feel the urge to jump in, a really good question to ask is, how can I be most helpful to you in this situation? And sometimes it'll be, I just want to have a bit of a whinge. Okay. I just want to come up with some options. Great, we'll do options. But when you've asked, how can I be of most help? Then the other person needs to think about how it would be helpful, and then you can have a chat about that. Now, it doesn't have to be a long dialogue. It could just be, that one question: how can I be most helpful to you?
Yeah.
But around one of the things that I teach in leadership training, but I'm sure it applies just as well in life, is about setting up the expectations. So this is what I expect from you as in my workplace, and this is what good means to me, and this is how I'm planning to help. How do you want help? So setting up those ground rules in the beginning of any relationship, whether it's a work one or with a partner, or just as your kids grow up and they get older, and you can talk to them about, well, this is what I'm going to help you with these days, and this is what I'm hoping that you should be able to do for yourself.
Yeah. That's such a great point. And it's that agreements, isn't it? It's that initial set of agreements, which is so often seen as something that's just applied in a formal setting, like a business and employee agreement or all of those sort of things. But actually, whether people want to call it an agreement or they're not happy with that word, it doesn't really matter. But in the end, it is an agreement between two people in any form of relating, whereby they're both agreed to the way they move forward. And whether it be a friendship, whether it be an intimate partner, a work colleague, a parent, a child, it doesn't really matter. It's both people giving the permission and agreeing that this is how we both want it to work going forward. And it just comes to that effective communication and assertiveness, doesn't it? I mean, the ability to be assertive and basically, to me, have boundaries with love is assertive,
Absolutely.
And so it is that step that I think is so often missing in the relationship dynamic, that then causes further implications, and people fall further into the negative part of these three archetypes.
Absolutely, and we all know the scenario where mum in the household gets annoyed because she's the only one that ever puts anything in the washing machine, and so she has a bit of a whinge to her girlfriend that my family is useless, and then she has a whinge to her husband who does something random like puts something into the washing machine and thinks he's rescuing, and then and then she'll have a go at the kids, who do you think I've got better things to do, and we've all been there, in and out of these kind of roles. Whereas, as you said, if we can sit down and have a respectful conversation about how things should be, and have some agreement about how they're going to go working forward, then everyone's clear. And it doesn't necessarily mean a formal meeting. It just means dialogue.
Absolutely. And I think that there's an important step that is really helpful to happen before people come to the dialogue, and that is working out individually what your needs are. Because if you come to a dialogue and you're not actually sure on what you want to gain out of it, or what your needs are that you want met, then how can you have the dialogue and then just kind of expect another person just to meet them because they should just meet them, basically, in your head? So I think the important step is really taking some time out and connecting with yourself and working out, well, in this circumstance, what are my needs? And not also putting them in concrete. These conversations are fluid and they can happen all the time. They're not set like a 12-month employee contract. They're done whereby it's like, well, at this present moment in time, this is what my needs are. What are your needs, and how can we come together so that we both have our needs met in the best way possible with the least amount of conflict?
Yep, absolutely. And it's surprisingly difficult, because you say to anyone in that moment, what do you want? And they say, I don't want the other person to. And you say, yeah, but what do you want?
Yeah.
And it's really hard. I just want, and sometimes that just takes a little sitting with and thinking about, what is it that I want, and what's this conversation going to be about? We know that when we go into challenging conversations that we have to think about, what's this conversation about? But sometimes it doesn't even have to be a challenging conversation. It just needs to be, what is it that I'm after in this interaction? Yeah. What do I need? Not what do I want them to do, but what do I need?
Yeah, and that brings me to another thought, and that's that if you are often playing out that victim or that receiver, then sometimes that person finds it really difficult to work out what their needs are, because the pattern for so long has been someone else rescuing you and disempowering you, which doesn't allow for your own confidence building, and you're seen as possibly incapable or not whole, and therefore you've reduced your ability to, you know, build resilience and think that you're capable and come forward with your needs, because for so long you've been in a pattern where somebody else has possibly rescued you or controlled the situation, and you've met their needs in that time, but yours have actually just been to follow whatever they've guided you by.
There's two things about the rescuer that I've not talked about, and that people don't like rescuers because there's that sniff of martyrdom too, because they will often look how much I've martyred myself and given away what I need in the service of what everybody else needs. But then the flip side of that is the more we rescue is that learned helplessness. You know, the more we do for somebody else, the less they can do for each other. So rescuer, I said in the beginning, that feels like sexier to be. It's more appealing. Yes, I want to be a rescuer. But on one hand, you're being seen as a martyr, and on the other hand, you're actually making people dependent. And what that stops you doing, as you just said, is being able to be clear about what is it that I need. What do I as a human being need?
Yeah. Well, there's so much in this, isn't there? And we could probably talk for hours. I mean, I'm hesitant to say this, but something that's come to my mind, and I'm hesitant because I know this word can sometimes be triggering for some people, but I'm going to say it anyway.
I'm a big girl, I'll work it out.
No, not you. You're not going to, I'm worried about the listeners, not you. Is it possible that the rescuer is actually displaying characteristics of narcissism with their need to control the narrative and actually just disempowering the victim?
That's interesting. Yes. Yeah. Look, potentially. I think we all have a tiny bit of narcissism in us. We all want to control.
It's a spectrum.
Yes. And we all want, it's basic self-determination theory. We all want to feel like we have some autonomy, that we have some competence, and we have some relatedness, that we belong in a group. And I think in any of those three styles, that's what people are trying to do. I'm trying to show you that I'm competent, that I can do things my way, and that I belong. And so it's really, all of those styles are just a way of trying to make somebody else listen to you, make yourself belong. So narcissists included. Well, actually, narcissists don't necessarily want to belong. They want to be better and control.
They want to control the narrative.
Yeah, they want to control the narrative. So yeah, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's an interesting one. I'll think about it.
Okay, so maybe a slightly less extreme angle for that is the helper possibly being a little bit selfish by robbing an opportunity for growth of the victim?
They'd never see it that way, but absolutely they are. Absolutely. That's where helping is not helpful. We learn by making mistakes. We learn by trial and error. We learn through stuffing up. And if we're always rescuing people, they don't get to learn. So the rescuer doesn't see themselves as being stifling, but yes, indeed they are.
Yeah. Because a rescue you'll often hear them say things like, my intentions are really good, I'm just trying to do the right thing, but really, is it the right thing? And how can we be, I suppose, more aware of the difference between their own need and the other person's need?
I think it comes down to this basic thing, which is, again, what Michael Bungay-Stanier talks about in his book, The Advice Trap. He talks about staying curious just a moment longer. So instead of rushing to give advice to help to rescue, you just stay curious. or just withhold just for a little bit longer, 5 seconds longer. And I train people to stay curious and then to ask a question rather than to give advice. So just withholding just a bit. Nobody's going to die in 5 more seconds of discomfort. And it's basic parenting 101. You know, we know that those helicopter parents aren't doing their kids any good by swooping in and fixing them. Same with the temptation to give advice or to rescue. Just stay curious a moment longer.
Yeah. So I think that that's probably a really good segue to talk more about how to help without overhelping, and how to be more like a more mindful and an empowering way to be supportive. So how do you support someone to help themselves, basically? So
yeah, and yes, so carry on, because I was just about to be curious for 5 more seconds, so finish that question.
I think that it's not necessarily a full question, but a segue to go into, all right, so this is all we've already discussed, you know, what does it all mean and what are the implications of it, but what can we, and we've touched briefly on some of the things that we can do to maybe communicate in better ways, like the agreements, and as we've talked about, being a little bit more curious and holding back. But let's just discuss that further and help people with more ideas and more tips about how you can sort of help someone without being over helping, and how do you support someone to help themselves?
Yeah. When I first started out, when I was doing my coach training to be a coach, and learning to listen, because I had a PhD in giving advice, but I wasn't very good at listening, as I explained earlier. One of the things that I really noticed was that when I was tempted to help or give advice, I leant forward and I'm finishing people's sentences. So what I consciously practiced doing for a long time was to sit back and to keep my mouth shut, because you can't listen and talk at the same time. And so I encourage people to do exactly the same thing. You will feel yourself lean forward and lean in when you want to help. Notice that, because that's your cue to lean back and just think, I can just wait. And in that waiting, think about a question or a way that you can encourage that person to think more deeply themselves. Funnily enough, I got pretty good at closing my mouth, because I thought that's all it was just to stop talking. But then I had some feedback from a client that said my body just spent the whole time saying, I'm about to tell you what to do. So that's where the sitting back part comes in. So when you're sitting back, I want you to be listening for what's really going on. Listen to the patterns of the words that people are using. And then empathize. When they've stopped talking, say, gosh, that sounds really hard. How can I best help you? And get them to talk some more. Because quite often if people talk out their challenges, they actually solve their own problems, which is what we want them to do, particularly our kids. We want them to logically solve their own problems. So there are a couple of things all joined in together. Listen, lean back, think of a question and empathize. And then sure, if someone says, I just need to know how to do this, then ask another question. So how could we find that out? Or what could we do? And that's encouraging other people to do the thinking, particularly good in challenge, kind of challenges that people are having. If someone doesn't know how to stack the dishwasher, well, then show them. and then, it doesn't work all the time. So not all of these strategies will work in every situation.
Yeah, and I think it's very dependent on the environment, whether it's a work environment, whether it's because you see this dynamic played out often with team leaders and the colleagues, and a leader sort of taking over and giving all the suggestions and not allowing people to come up with their own ideas and do their own thinking and, claim ownership of their own insights. And I think that you often see that in a work environment. And so in that environment, I suppose it's about leadership, growth, or communication, or better understanding the whole room and leaving space for everybody to be able to grow and learn and contribute. But in an environment,
uncomfortable. Sorry, and as you were saying that, as a leader, being uncomfortable with silence, or in fact anybody being uncomfortable with silence. So when you say, "What do you think?" understanding that you need to be silent for a bit of time, rather than, "What do you think?" "Oh, nothing. Let me tell you what you think."
Yes.
Absolutely. It's very uncomfortable with silence.
Yeah, and really understanding the different personality types. And I think that's where the key to leadership comes in. And really just, it's not about knowing everybody in the room's skill set for a particular technical skill that the project needs. It's actually understanding them on a personality level as well, and understanding that some people process internally and they're more introverted and they need a second, and it's not that they're not going to come out with the possible solutions or the ideas, it's just that they don't spit it out without filtering or thinking, and other people will just go blah blah blah, brainstorm. And I suppose it's then again that relationship dynamic of really understanding the people that you're working in a collaborative way, and not just making assumptions or thinking that everybody thinks the way that you do.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. Spot on.
So that's that example. But I think that going on, you were talking before more on household stuff and children, and giving them the opportunity to learn new things without you taking it over. Now, I 100% agree with that, but I think that in my experience, I know that sometimes I've come up against that relentlessness of a child who just wants to take the lazy option. And that idea that I know that it's not the best path to take, and that I shouldn't be rescuing them in those situations. But the energy it takes for me not to rescue them and allow them either the space to do it their own, or the convincing for them to do it on their own, is really tough. So in those circumstances, when you know that rescuing is not the right option, and yet not rescuing feels just so much more harder, what is your suggestion?
It's always going to be so much harder in this really fast-paced world, because we don't have a lot of time just to let people sit and, learn to tie their shoelaces. Sometimes they're off to daycare and we need to put their shoelaces on and just get going. And so it's about knowing that there are times when you're going to need to give advice, you're going to need to tell people what to do, and kids or staff, and you're going to need to put some accountability and timelines on things. That's part of being adult too, is insisting that this is what needs to happen in this amount of time. But in this fast-paced world, that's really challenging. And one of the reasons that we swoop in is because it's just faster. However, a very wise person said to me once, the more you insist, the more they resist. Yes. So sometimes the more we tell, the more we actually get people's back off, and it actually slows things down. Yeah. So we think giving advice is speeding things up, but we're actually making people dependent on us, and it will slow them down in the long run. So
yeah. And you can look at that the opposite way too. Whatever we resist persists.
Correct. Yep.
Yeah. So, it's so true, isn't it? And it's that fine line between looking, especially with the parenting child model, of looking at it as the long game and looking at it as, picking your battles. And sometimes you're going to pick your battles and jump in, and sometimes you're going to have the energy to play the long game. And that then comes again back to your own self-awareness of what have you got capacity for at that particular time. And if you really don't have capacity for the argument or the ability to just have the patience and tolerance to walk away and ignore the tantrum, then the implications of your possible reaction at that time, if you don't have capacity, could escalate to make the relationship dynamic worse than if you know that at that point in time that you've got the capacity to just let them have their tanty, get over it, and then address it again.
Yeah. Good emotional intelligence. It works at home and it works at work. You know, what's going to be the best thing to do in this situation? What's my mood? What's the motive for this conversation or this interaction? And, you know, what's my motivation? So, it's being aware of all of those things, and we'll always be much better at that when we're well rested, when we've had enough to drink, if we've been to the toilet, if we're not rushing out the door,
and that's so true, and that's where there is that interconnected and integrated life that people forget. Like, they have their well-being as a very separate thing to the other parts, whether it be their work or whether it be their relationships, and they see the well-being part like the sleep and the eating and the exercising and all of those things that contribute to your performance, very individual, and they don't necessarily integrate it to how it has a ripple effect in everything else that you do, which is why it's so important to integrate all your personal well-being, whether it be the health-related stuff or otherwise, to come to the situation in the best possible, in your, best potential. By actually looking after yourself in the best way possibly, physically, emotionally, physically, spiritually, etc. So, I think that that's a really good point, that we need to look after ourselves, and that's where the whole self-care comes in, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. We are more likely to be our worst self if we're not well fed, slept, or, if we've not eaten or moved very much. So yes, you're absolutely right. They're not separate things. We will be our best self at home and at work if we've looked after ourselves. Which
sort of then goes back to that idea that we talked about before, which was that the implications of being a rescuer is that you're exhausted, is that you don't have energy, and that you don't have all those things, and therefore you can continue to perpetuate that same problem, and the relationships are going to be challenging because you're devoid of energy, because you've been a rescuer. And it just goes on in the cycle.
Exactly. And so you just got to step out of that and start with yourself. Yeah, because you can't change other people. You can only change yourself. So start there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's where the goal really is, just connection to ourselves and to others, and, that basic human need to just feel connected all round is probably the summary of the reason that you just do everything that you do.
Yep. And if you're not integrated, if it's not connected, then you split into those modes of rescuer, persecutor, or victim. Whereas if you are fully in your integrated, egoless adult self, you don't find the need to have any of those other roles.
Yes, and that sums it up brilliantly. So I think that that's probably a really good place to leave the conversation. And I think maybe even leaving it with a question for everyone. So maybe a question that says, does helping enhance our connection with others, or does it harm our connection? And I'm not asking you to answer that.
No, didn't think so.
Because I think that's a whole nother episode.
Yeah.
But I think it's a really good question for leaving the listeners to really think about, because we've sort of talked about this whole idea of helping versus over-helping, and then got to this space where really our overall goal is connection and feeling connected. So I think it'd be really good to leave everyone with that question of, does helping enhance connection, or does it harm connection? And maybe if you've got to this part of the episode and you've stayed with us all the way, thank you for doing that. And maybe you can share your response in the comments below, whether you're listening on one of the podcast platforms or on YouTube or through any social media channels. Maybe you can just share in the comments what your thoughts are on that, or any other thoughts that you've got in our conversation that we've had today. Is there anything else, even though I said I'll leave it there, that you are itching to say that I haven't covered?
No, I'm going to put my advice monster away for today. No, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. It was so lovely to talk to you about these things, and no, nothing more from me. Thank you, Lisa.
Brilliant. So thanks so much, Jenny. It's so great to learn more about this, this topic, and get your opinions and your views, and just have this juicy conversation. I think it's something that is important, no matter if you're listening from a perspective of personal or professional, or any type of relationship that you're having. So thanks again for joining me today. I'd love to know what your biggest takeaway or insight is for today's conversation. Leave a comment and do let us know. If you'd like any more information on Jenny or some of the services or programs that she offers, how could they find you, Jenny?
They can email me directly, jenny@positivelybeaming.com.au. But my website, positivelybeaming.com.au, has all my social media links as well. Love for you to be in touch if I can help in any way.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you so much. And if you've enjoyed the episode, please share it with your friends and consider subscribing to the Wealthy Living podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and on YouTube. To find out more about my services, you can visit my website at wealthyliving.com.au or connect with me on any of my social media channels. Until next time, remember, connection is medicine.